Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 17 waiver wire targets for the 2019 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about news around the National Football League as it pertains to fantasy football. Yes, a lot of you are still playing in Week 17, even though that's an unfortunate case, and we'll talk about why that is an unfortunate case in a little bit. But I'm still here to help you guys out, try to help you guys capture championships here in Week 17. So we'll talk about news, some injured players, and who potentially may not be playing in Week 17. Then after that, we're going to be talking about my running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, and defensive waiver wire targets going into the week. And that's pretty much it. So without further ado, before we get into that, let me remind all of you, if you have not yet already, help us get to that 13,000 subscriber mark. Join the community by clicking the subscribe button. Also, click the bell notification button to stay up to date on my latest content. And if you like today's video, don't forget to click the like button. Thank you very much. Hey everybody, how's it going? Happy holidays. Hope everyone's doing well. Okay, so for many of you, you have already captured or played in your Week 17 championship games and all is set. A couple things that I wanted to mention. If in fact you did capture a championship this past week, I know many of you are still waiting on the result of a Monday night game, whether it's a Boone or a Devontae Adams, Aaron Jones, one of the two quarterbacks. You guys are still waiting on that. But if in fact you do win a championship, I'd like you, if you're watching this video, to go down to the comment section and let me know what your championship lineup was. I kind of find interest in seeing what kind of ownership of what players were most used in championship winning lineups. So I kind of wanted to get a little perspective there. But other than that, we're good to go. I got the hat on because it is holiday season. We're sitting here December 23rd, a couple days away from Christmas. So happy holidays to all of you. Whatever you celebrate, that's awesome. Either way, let's talk about some news around the National Football League that pertain to fantasy football. So number one has to do with the Baltimore Ravens. So like I mentioned before, the reason why you don't want to play in a Week 17 championship is mainly because when teams fully clinch their division and have a first-round bye or can't win anything more with a win in Week 17, they often rest their starters in preparation for the playoffs. Now, one of the teams that is ahead and cannot be stopped from being the number one seed of the AFC and having a bye week is the Baltimore Ravens. They have already stated that Lamar Jackson, Marshall Yanda, Mark Ingram, many of their starters are not going to be playing in Week 17. So that would force, a Robert Griffin to be starting for the Baltimore Ravens. Gus Edwards would be the starting running back, and they would have backups everywhere. So it would be extremely unfortunate that if you were a Lamar Jackson or that you've gotten this far and now you can't even use him in your championship lineup. Like that's brutal, but that's just the way it is. That's why everyone tries to lock it in so where weeks 14, 15, and 16 are playoffs. But again, I know different leagues do it differently because some commissioners are stubborn, don't want to change it. Unfortunately, you may be a part of that, but it's okay. As of right now, you learn, you move on to the next season, and hopefully lock it down to 16 weeks maximum and have it that way. But other than that, in terms of news, Kyler Murray left yesterday's game with an injury. Had an MRI. He's still been dealing with that hamstring injury going back to even after coming off their bye week. So he's been dealing with his hamstring injury. The MRI didn't show anything significant, nothing alarming for the organization to have to worry about him. So he should be fine. I'm assuming that he'll be good to go this week, and that's hopefully the case. But we'll see what happens exactly with his progression through the week. They don't have to push him. Again, he is a young quarterback. They are not playing for a playoff berth. And to be honest, if they want, they can hold him out and hold him and make sure he's healthy going into next year, because that's pretty much the priority. Outside of that, we saw a lot of injuries take place yesterday. On the other side of that matchup in the Cardinals game, Chris Carson out for the season, CJ Prosise out for the season, season-ending injuries, Carson with the hip. That was an extremely brutal, unfortunate happening because for many of you, Chris Carson was carrying your team and was hopefully going to continue in championship week. An unfortunate injury pretty much ended his season and it could potentially end the Seahawks season because of how vital their running game is. With three of their running backs out, Prosise, Penny, and Carson now, we look to what? Travis Homer? Sure, he's on today's list. He's over there. But there's also talks about potentially Marshawn Lynch coming back to the Seahawks, having a reunion. Sure, last time he played was in 2018 for the Oakland Raiders. He was sent to the IR pretty early in the season and wasn't really, didn't look to come back. They cut him. They drafted Josh Jacobs. They didn't have to worry about him. But there's a potential that I'm hearing that there is interest from both sides and they could get a deal done. If in fact the deal is to be cracked, I don't think he'd see too many snaps in Week 17. considering, again, they still need to make sure that he's ready for playoffs. He'd probably get a couple snaps here and there, but again, nothing too significant. Again, they are playing against the 49ers, who hold a pretty significant lead at this point. But if they were to beat the 49ers again, they could potentially win their division. So outside of that, no other news that pertains to fantasy football that's extremely relevant. Let's go ahead. Let's move on. Let's talk about some waiver wire targets for the running back position going into week 17. Starting off with my number one. It's kind of insane how DeAndre Washington currently, and when I was making these graphics, was only owned in 48% of leagues going into week 16. It's pretty crazy. I mean, the great weeks that he has had in the absence of Josh Jacobs proved just his value just ridiculously. Just yesterday against the Chargers, had 23 rushes for 85 yards, had a rushing touchdown, had some work in the receiving game, 17.6 fantasy points, and still yet he's only owned in 48% of Yahoo Fantasy leagues, and was picked up 12% just yesterday, right? So prior to that, he was only owned in 36% of leagues. That's just far too little. For a guy like DeAndre Washington, who is a starting running back, who's proven earlier in the season, in fact, in week 14, that he can get it done as a starting running back of this Oakland Raiders offense, it's kind of ridiculous that he's not owned in more leagues. If he's not owned in yours already, you should 100% be going and picking him up. But I'm assuming for many of you, he's already gone going into week 17. But I wanted to go ahead and mention that. Moving on to number two, we had Dion Lewis. Dion Lewis, as of right now, with the concern of Derrick Henry's hamstring and whether or not he's going to potentially play in week 17. They play against the Texans. The Texans have already won their division. They've already established that they are going to probably be a team that is... They did beat the Patriots, so let's put it this way. If the Texans win and the Patriots lose, the Texans could potentially get a first-round bye, and they would have to hope that the Kansas City Chiefs would also lose. So there's a bunch of little tidbits here and there. But either way, if in fact on the other side of the ball, in the Tennessee Titans running back situation, if Derrick Henry is to be absent once again in week 17, then in fact Dion Lewis is a guy that needs to be picked up. I mentioned it yesterday multiple times that he should be picked up and could potentially be played as a RB3 flex option, considering his usage. As of yesterday, he did get decent usage. Obviously, he could have been better, but that's pretty much any offensive option that had a poor week. But all we know is that certainly Dion Lewis is going to get touches. Regardless of who's in that backfield, Dion Lewis will always get touches because we've seen him do it in the past. We saw him for majority of last season prior to Derrick Henry's breakout. We saw Dion Lewis have a pretty big share of the backfield and play like nearly 66% of the snaps. I'm trying to find Dion Lewis's stats from yesterday. Goodness gracious, can I not find it? Thank you. Here we go. So what did Dion Lewis do yesterday? He had 15 rushes for 68 yards against a pretty good run-stopping defense, which was actually pretty surprising. But then again, that's what happens when you put Dion Lewis in the backfield. Majority of the times, you're going to get a defense expecting him to come in for pass plays, and then when he comes in for the occasional run or two out of a draw, out of anything of that sort, it's pretty significant and makes a pretty big difference. In the passing game, again, I would have loved to see more usage. Only had one catch for 19 yards on 2 targets. But again, the offense for the Tennessee Titans kind of stagnated yesterday, considering how good that New Orleans defense was at times. But anyway, outside of the first quarter, the Titans pretty much slowed down for the rest of the game. Either way, Dion Lewis, if he's available, if you are a Derrick Henry owner, needs to be picked up. If you're not a Derrick Henry owner, still a good pickup and play, potentially in week 17 if Henry is out. Moving on, number 3 is Tony Pollard. Now, here's my thought process. Tony Pollard has had really good games this year, specifically when the Cowboys are up early and are blowing out defenses. And I'm thinking this may be a week. In week 17, when they know they have to play against the Washington Redskins at home. The Washington Redskins have given up so many points to opposing running backs on the ground that I 100% believe that without a doubt the Cowboys are going to run all over them. And that starts with Zeke, but it will 100%, the nail in the coffin will be Tony Pollard. Just talking about what they've given up on the ground. They gave Saquon 189 on the ground, 90 through the air, and 2 total touchdowns just yesterday. The week before that, Miles Sanders went for 122 on the ground, 50 through the air, 2 touchdowns. The week before that, Aaron Jones went for 134, 58 through the air, and 1 touchdown. Every running back against the Washington Redskins in the last 3 weeks has dominated. I mean, put up at least 28 fantasy points in a half-point PPR scoring format. So, going into week 17, once the Cowboys take a lead and they've mounted that lead and they have it and they're good to go, Tony Pollard's going to come in because Zeke is going to take a step out, and Tony Pollard is going to potentially run for one of these big games. And we've seen him do it multiple times this season, where he'll come in against Miami, against the Rams last week, against Detroit a couple weeks ago. Like, we've seen him come in and have big games. Against Miami, 13 rushes for 103 and a touchdown. It was 2 weeks ago against the Rams. He went for 12 rushes, 131 and a touchdown. He comes in late in fourth quarters and dominates in the second half. And I think it will be no surprise to me if Tony Pollard does that against the Washington Redskins this coming week for the Dallas Cowboys. Considering Dak's injury, but considering that offense has just been just terrible, especially yesterday. But either way, I think Tony Pollard, not a bad pickup at all. A guy that you might be not really expecting, but I think is a pretty good option. Moving on. Number 4 is Travis Homer. Travis Homer, when he came in to the game yesterday, he had 6 receptions. That was fantastic. In a PPR format, that's great. But again, they have to play against the 49ers. It's not an easy task. But if, in fact, he is a starting running back for that team, then he could have some potential value. That being said, again, I did mention that Marshawn Lynch could potentially be signed. They could sign somebody else. There's always a possibility that somebody else gets picked up somewhere down the line, whether they be, a relevant running back or somebody just to come steal some snaps here and there, just to give them a little bit more depth at the position, just to prevent an injury from taking place and really killing their season. So again, as of right now, the only running back on roster that's healthy is Travis Homer. Unless they're going to bring somebody up from the practice squad, he's the only guy on pace to even get any work in that backfield this coming week against the 49ers. So keep that in mind. Outside of that's pretty much it for him. Moving on, we have number 5, Gus Edwards. Like I mentioned earlier, the Baltimore Ravens are not going to be starting majority of their offense and their defense starters. They're going to pretty much rest them because it does not matter if they lose in Week 17 to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Pittsburgh Steelers definitely want to win in order to try to make a playoff run. But again, the Baltimore Ravens, they do not care if they win or lose. They're going to definitely try. But Gus Edwards and I'm thinking it's going to be Gus Edwards because there's always a possibility that Hill comes in and potentially takes some work and they split carries. But Mark Ingram's definitely not playing. And I think no matter what, Gus Edwards could have some potential value this week against the Steelers. I know they've got a pretty good run defense, but at the end of the day, I still think a running back like Edwards has proven in the past, especially last season, a little bit this season when he's given opportunities, that he could be a great contributor overall in fantasy. And I think he's not a bad pickup going into Week 17. The last running back I wanted to mention is Rex Burkhead. Now, Rex Burkhead pretty much evaporated all of James White's value this past week. And what we've seen in the last couple weeks from the Patriots is a run-heavy offense, right? They're getting into their playoff mode where they want to run the ball, they want to kill clock, and they want to let their defense dominate. That's what they did for majority of last season's postseason. In the 3 games that they played, they dominated in the running game against the Chargers, the Chiefs, and against the Rams. And that's exactly where they want to get to, right? With Sony Michel, and then especially Rex Burkhead. Rex Burkhead was a guy that, especially in that Chiefs game last season in the AFC Championship game, a lot of people slept on him because majority of that season, he was hurt. He was hurt. He had an injury, and it plagued him. This season, he's been in and out of the lineup, as we've seen, but he's been more of a prominent used running back in the last couple of weeks. Last week, 4 catches on 4 targets for 77 yards, got some work on the ground, had a rushing touchdown. This is a guy that is continuously getting some work, had some value early in the season, dealt with some injuries himself, but is getting stronger now and could potentially be a play this coming week for the Patriots as they play against the Miami Dolphins. Again, this is going to be a matchup, in my opinion, where the Dolphins they're going to get worked because, again, the Patriots need to win to confirm that the Kansas City Chiefs cannot catch them and their record and potentially play upsets, special. That considering the Chiefs have beaten the Patriots in their one-on-one matchup this season. So again, Rex Burkhead late in the game could run the ball a bunch and have a lot of value. That is why I'm suggesting you potentially pick him up in Week 17. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about wide receivers going into Week 17. I got 8 names here. Number 1, starting off with Sterling Shepard. I think this pretty much holds for every single every single New York Giants wide receiver, whether it's Shepard, Slayton, Lattimore, Tate. All of them had incredible weeks this past week against the Washington Redskins. And Daniel Jones had 5 completed touchdown passes with Saquon Barkley going for 189 on the ground and a rushing touchdown. This was a completely different Giants offense, and it was mainly because of the matchup. Now that we look into this coming week against the Eagles, a defense that, sure, up front can play stout, but in the secondary have struggled. I really do think that there is a very good possibility that Daniel Jones can come out here and light him up. And with the help of a guy like Sterling Shepard, his number one wide receiver at the moment, could end up being, doing some good damage. Again, if Sterling Shepard's available and or any of these other New York Giants wide receivers, they are of pretty good significant value, in my opinion, coming into this week. So go ahead and check your waiver wire. If there is a Slayton or a Tate or a Shepard available, go ahead and pick those guys up. Moving on. Number 2 is Justin Watson for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Justin Watson had a touchdown this past week, even though he didn't see as many targets as Brashad Perriman or even got as many yards as Perriman, a guy that broke over the 100 receiving yard mark, which was incredible despite how much struggling we saw from Jameis Winston. The Buccaneers still play against the Falcons this week, and I think Justin Watson's still going to have a lot of opportunity. And if, again, he is available in your league, this is a guy that can certainly be a plug-and-play kind of guy at a wide receiver 3 potential, considering how many other wide receivers going into this week could potentially miss, considering bye weeks and all that kind of jazz. This is a guy that could potentially be picked up and played. Not a bad option. He's my number 2. Moving on to number 3, Hunter Renfrow. Hunter Renfrow came back from a broken rib from a couple weeks ago and just exploded onto the scene this past week. In fact, he took a slant to the house for 70-some-odd yards this past week. And was that much of a surprise? No, because we know Derek Carr and Hunter Renfrow, prior to Renfrow's injury, was a pretty significant, option for this offense. He was getting games in which he was scoring touchdowns, 88 receiving yards on 4 receptions, 6 receptions for 54, 5 receptions for 66. He was used heavily in this offense. This past week, saw his all-time high in terms of targets, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 107 yards, and a touchdown. That's pretty promising in my opinion, especially considering where the Raiders sit at this moment in time. The Raiders need 5 things to happen this week in order for them to make the playoffs as a wild card. Are you telling me that they have a chance? Absolutely. And I think they're going to come out and they're going to try their best to beat the Broncos, and they could potentially do that. And Hunter Renfrow will be one of the receiving options on this offense. Could definitely make a difference. So again, Hunter Renfrow, another one of these options to go ahead and look at. Moving on to number 4, Greg Ward Jr. Greg Ward had himself a decent game despite a pretty tough secondary in the Dallas Cowboys defense. All that considered, he had a pretty good game. Let's pull this up. Excuse me. There it is. All right. Mr. Greg Ward. What the heck? What are we doing? Okay, there it is. For the 3rd week in a row, this guy has seen majority of targets. Again, in the last 3 weeks, 9. This past week only had 5 targets, but 4 receptions for 71 yards. Made a pretty significant difference in this offense. This coming week, they play against the New York Giants in New York. But again, this is a secondary that has struggled. We saw Steven Sims and Terry McLaurin and a tight end that I've never even heard of have some pretty good games against the New York Giants secondary. And again, Greg Ward currently is the number 1 wide receiver of this team, with a little bit of injuries to Zach Ertz, a little bit of uncertainty there. Again, this team continues to fall apart. Greg Ward is not a bad option. We mentioned him last week. I will mention him once again. Moving on, number 5, Diontae Johnson. With all of the quarterback changes, we saw Hodges come in, get replaced after 2 interceptions. Then Mason Rudolph come in, get injured. Hodges comes back. Diontae Johnson continues to be, in my opinion, Devlin Hodges' favorite target as of right now. As of the last couple of weeks, he's continuously gotten himself more and more targets. Even with Juju Smith-Schuster back, Diontae Johnson was the number 1 targeted receiver from yesterday's game, and that wasn't really by accident. Juju Smith-Schuster is out there as a distraction, while Diontae Johnson can continue to feast. In the last 3 weeks, 8, 7, and 9 targets. This past week, 8 receptions, 81 yards, and a touchdown. He's had some pretty good weeks in the last 3 weeks, and that's very good, to be honest, considering they play against Baltimore, and a Baltimore defense that could potentially be sitting all of their starters. Diontae Johnson could be a guy that can come in and have himself a pretty decent game here for the Pittsburgh Steelers and in fantasy. So he's my number 5. Moving on, Steven Sims Jr. We talked about him last week, and we mentioned the fact that he did see a lot of targets and that he could be of value to fantasy owners that are playing in deeper leagues, because having 11 targets for 5 receptions against the Philadelphia Eagles, that's no joke, because 11 targets just means that you are favorited by your quarterback and you're going to see a lot more targets considering you're like the number 2 wide receiver of that offense. This past week, saw similar numbers, had 10 targets, 6 receptions, 64 yards, but the biggest bonus was having 2 receiving touchdowns this past week, only 1 the week prior. He's only getting better, and he's only seeing more and more opportunities. That is pretty favorable. To be honest, this coming week against the Cowboys defense, it's going to be tough, but still, I think a guy like Steven Sims Jr., who's moving around the lineup and in the formations, could be of value considering his usage, because, again, 10-plus targets, that's no joke. That's just innate value And if, in fact, the Washington Redskins can move the ball, whether it's with Haskins and or a guy like Case Keenum, I think Steven Sims could be of value. Moving on, number 7, John Ross. John Ross had a little bit of a similar stat line than what he had earlier this season when the season began. We saw him with 10-plus targets this past week against Miami. Of course, this is a game that went to all the way down the line, down to the wire in overtime. But still, again, having 13 targets is no joke. Playing against the Browns this coming week, if in fact, Tyler Boyd's still dealing with that little bit of a hamstring injury from yesterday. If in fact we see a little bit less usage of Tyler Boyd this week, we could see, perhaps John Ross take the top off the defense and make some plays here and there, and could be of value. So he's my number 7. Moving on to the last wide receiver I wanted to mention, it's Tajae Sharpe of the Tennessee Titans. Now, A.J. Brown was pretty much absent after his 1 reception and a 49-yard rushing attempt out of the backfield, which was an absolutely beautiful play. When they hand people the ball out of this backfield that are not running backs, they still seem to manage to have really big runs. The week before, they had Jonnu Smith out of the backfield. They ran a halfback toss, and he ran for 56. They handed the ball to A.J. Brown this past week. He went for 49 and a touchdown with some great speed. That's beautiful. That's fantastic. That's what we want to see. We want to see playmakers make plays. But in fact, with Adam Humphries being a little injured, with Corey Davis being a little bit banged up, what I see as it right now is a potential that Tajae Sharpe, who had 2 touchdowns this past week, could end up being of value against the Houston secondary this coming week. Again, this is a guy that isn't really talked about because he doesn't get too many snaps or opportunities in this offense, but again, had a huge week, stepped up, could potentially be of service if Corey Davis is not to potentially not play this coming week. He's my number 8. All right, let's go to move on. Let's talk about tight ends going into week 17. Starting off with my number 1 is Dallas Goedert. Again, Dallas Goedert is a guy that's still not owned in very many leagues, but again, I'm not really surprised. Again, I mean, when you're the number 2 of your respective team, people are not going to look to you to try to solve their issues or their problems at the tight end position, and it happens. I understand. So when we look at what he did just this past week, a lot of it had to do with the fact that, again, Zach Ertz went down with an injury. But we know that this offense loves to use the tight end position. We saw Ertz and Goedert, even the week before against Washington in Week 15, both nearly played 90% of the snaps. And in this past week against the Cowboys, who are terrible against the tight end position, we saw Dallas Goedert carry the team. 12 targets, 9 receptions for 91 yards and a touchdown. That is an incredible performance, and that's something that if in fact we're going to see an absence of Zach Ertz in Week 17, could be of value because they play against the New York Giants. The New York Giants are not that good of a defense, and I truly do believe Dallas Goedert could take advantage of that and be a really big play. Because if we go back and we look at what a guy like Zach Ertz did against the, against the New York Giants a couple weeks back, it was no joke. And here it is exactly. He had 13 targets, 9 receptions, 91 yards, and 2 touchdowns against the New York Giants. That's Zach Ertz. Again, dealing with a rib injury. If in fact he is, when they go and they test at MRI, he takes a couple tests and they figure that, he's not healthy enough to play in Week 17, Dallas Goedert, without a doubt, is a huge pickup and play. Moving on to number 2, we have Jonnu Smith. Again, I was mentioning Jonnu Smith because of the fact that I think the Texans could potentially sit some players this week. And if in fact they do, their secondary is still pretty much beat up and can't make too many plays. Even though they caused some turnovers against Jameis Winston, I still think a guy like Jonnu Smith is seeing more and more work because of the absence of other receivers. Again, when A.J. Brown disappears like that, it makes a pretty significant difference in the offense, but other guys have to step up accordingly, and Jonnu Smith has done that for the last couple of weeks, especially in the absence of a Derrick Henry. The offense is a little different, and Jonnu Smith getting some work could be of value. Moving on, Mike Gesicki, the number 2 tight end from this past week against the Cincinnati Bengals, had 2 receiving touchdowns, 82 total yards, and 6 receptions on a buttload of targets, 12 targets exactly, which is absolutely incredible. That in itself is pretty valuable. Now they play against the Patriots. The Patriots are probably going to be starting all their studs, but again, there's always a potential of some garbage time and/or Mike Gesicki just outbodying some receivers. This is a big tight end. This is a big-bodied guy that if in fact you just throw it into the range of his wingspan, he's going to go up and he's going to make a play. So could be a value. Moving on to number 4, O.J. Howard, playing against the Atlanta Falcons this week. Again, O.J. Howard wasn't bad this past week, but when you have Cameron Brate in the lineup and they're both getting decent target counts here and there, it's going to take away from one of them. There were a couple plays where O.J. Howard, if he in fact caught it instead of it tipping off his fingertips, could have had almost maybe 80 receiving yards total. I'm not even kidding. He could have had a double his performance just this past week, which was unfortunate. But again, is promising. So this coming week could be a value going into week 17. The last couple options, Tyler Eifert, yes, he caught a late game touchdown that made a pretty big difference in overtime. To send it to overtime, that little bit of a Hail Mary, not really Hail Mary, it was like only a 40-yard pass, but this is a guy that saw a lot of targets, 8 targets, 4 receptions, 57 yards, scored a touchdown. Could be a value against the Browns if, in fact, the Browns defense cannot lock down anything that the Cincinnati Bengals are sending towards them. Tyler Eifert's one of the more favorite targets. Obviously, doesn't see as many snaps because they're trying to keep him healthy. Again, this is the first season and maybe his entire career that he's played almost every single game. In fact, he's played every single game this year. And prior to that, he hadn't played 16 games in the last 4 years combined. So, again, they're trying to keep him healthy, but, again, not a bad option. Last option here, Kaden Smith. With a guy like Evan Ingham going to the IR this past week, the Giants still needed a tight end. They didn't use Rhett Ellison. Kaden Smith came in as a receiving option. The guy was a number 5 tight end in fantasy this past week. 8 targets, 6 receptions, 35 yards, and had himself 2 receiving touchdowns down in the red zone. Pretty good option this week, potentially against the Eagles. Moving on, let's talk about some quarterbacks going into week 17, starting off with another Giant, Daniel Jones. Again, Daniel Jones had the number 1 week amongst all quarterbacks in a 6-point per passing touchdown format. 45 points, 5 passing touchdowns, 352 yards passing. That's incredible. And I think against the Eagles, not a bad option at all, to be honest. Again, the Cowboys didn't look good, but I really do think that there's a potential that the New York Giants at home could air it out, whether it's in garbage time or whatever format, and potentially be a pretty good play here. Moving on to number 2, we have Jared Goff. I don't think that the Arizona Cardinals is that good, and I think that from the performances that we've seen from the Rams in the last couple of weeks, especially in garbage time, it kind of gives me confidence to consider Goff. What we've seen in the last couple of weeks, 2 passing touchdowns each of the last 4 games. Yes, he turns over the ball. 4 interceptions in the last 4 weeks. That happens. But he's at least completing touchdowns consistently. They're passing the ball nearly, I want to say 40 times a game on average in the last 4 weeks. That's promising. And the last time he played against the Arizona Cardinals, went for 29 total fantasy points in the 6-point per passing touchdown format. Again, could be a value this coming week as my number 2. Moving on to number 3, Baker Mayfield plays against the Cincinnati Bengals. Again, when we see Ryan Fitzpatrick throw for 4 passing touchdowns and 400 yards against the Bengals, it leads me to believe that Baker Mayfield can, for the love of God, at least get something similar or close to it, because the Bengals are not that good on defense. They have not been. They only have 1 win for a reason, and hopefully Baker Mayfield could take advantage of said matchup and produce a pretty decent week. Moving on to number 4, we have Derek Carr. Derek Carr had one of his better games this past week, but again, well, I don't know. It's kind of tough when I even say that. He had a rushing touchdown, had a passing touchdown, had over 290 passing yards. That's great. That's typically what you want to see from Derek Carr. 2 touchdowns, good total yards, 250 plus, and he's safe. He's safe. He doesn't turn over the ball, and he could play perfectly. That's what we could potentially see once again this week in Week 17 against the Denver Broncos. If he can play it safe, if he just scores his 2 touchdown minimum and gets it done, perfectly fine. Not a bad option. Moving on to number 5, Andy Dalton against the Cleveland Browns again. Andy Dalton had one of his best weeks in a while. 4 passing touchdowns, almost 400 passing yards. This is great. Again, it's against Miami, and that happens, but it could be of value against the Browns potentially. Moving on, we have ourselves Drew Lock as my number 6 option. Drew Lock will be playing against the Oakland Raiders. Again, this is a defense that is not very good in terms of its secondary. At times, obviously, Phillip Rivers didn't do anybody any big favors yesterday, but again, Drew Lock could be a pretty decent value this week. He struggled, in the last couple of games, but this past week was a lot better than a lot of people give him credit for. 25 for 33 passing. Sure, his yard per completion average wasn't great, but again, he was efficient and he got the job done and could potentially be good this week at home against the Raiders. All right, let's go ahead and move on and let's talk about the last couple waiver wire targets. Talking about defensive waiver wire targets going into week 17. Number 1 is the New Orleans Saints. Now, a lot of you in Week 16 asked Andrew, what do you feel about the Colts defense playing against the Carolina Panthers and Will Grier's first start? He's a rookie. I thought to myself, well, Will Grier can't be that bad, right? He wasn't that bad. He turned over the ball late, but the Colts had 2 punt returns that were ridiculous from Nyheim Hines. Now, that being said, the New Orleans Saints still play against this rookie quarterback, and I really do think that they're going to just swallow him up and really force him to make a lot of mistakes this week. So I think the New Orleans Saints are not bad at defense this week if they're still available. Moving on to number 2, Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay, despite everything, seems to manage to score almost every single week on the defensive side of the football, and or their defensive line just causing havoc. When you have Shaq Barrett and Ndamukong Suh and Jason Pierre-Paul rushing the passer, and they bringing guys off the edge, or corner blitzes, or safety blitzes, or linebackers coming through gaps like Levante David, they're just forcing so much chaos into that backfield that they're really just causing just too much pressure for opposing quarterbacks. Now, the thing that we've seen all season long, or at least as of late, is that Matt Ryan struggles against pressure, and the offensive line falls apart very easily. If Tampa Bay can force that, then we could potentially see a pretty good game from this Tampa Bay defense. Moving on to Kansas City Chiefs defense. Again, this is a defense that's consistently doing it. They did it once again yesterday, and they're getting better and better as the playoffs approach. This coming week, again, they need to continue to win into potentially getting hold of the AFC bye week. They could potentially be a number 1 or 2 seed this coming week. Again, they do play against the Los Angeles Chargers, an offense that has been struggling heavily. But again, Phillip Rivers wants to turn over the ball, and they could potentially force him to do so. Moving on to number 4, the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts don't play a good offense. They play against the Jaguars. They could potentially dominate that team. Obviously, the special teams plays that they made this past week make a pretty significant difference in their scoring. That's a boost of 12 points. But again, they still played very well. They had 30 total points as a defense. That in itself is ridiculous. That would have been an 18-point game nonetheless without even the punt returns. So that's very impressive in a defense that could continue to keep on this momentum. Closing out, we have the Green Bay Packers playing against the Detroit Lions. David Blau, not a great quarterback, and the Packers could force him to make some mistakes here and there. Again, this is a team that, regardless of whether they win again tonight, they still need to probably capture maybe a 13th win in week 17 in order to confirm that they're going to get a bye week in the first round. And in the last defense I wanted to mention, a lot of people have asked me about Minnesota, and a lot of people have said that their Minnesota defense is available in their leagues. Depending on what happens tonight, we'll kind of give you a little bit of indication because, again, we haven't watched the Monday night game against the Green Bay Packers and the Vikings today, but they go ahead and they play against who is it that they play in week 17? Goodness, why am I blanking out? Where is this list? The Minnesota Vikings, they play against the Chicago Bears. Again, Trubisky, not that good. If they could take advantage of that, clamp them now. Similar to what the Chiefs did last night, they could be pretty good. Anyway, thank you everybody for watching. I appreciate you guys spending your time today watching today's video. Tomorrow, we'll talk about some running backs. Until then, I appreciate it, and I'll catch you guys again. Happy holidays. See you.